profesor de la Universidad de Montana en los Estados Unidos. Tenemos la suerte de hoy día acompañarnos a Cara Nelson. Damos la bienvenida con un aplauso.
Hola, buenos días. I am so excited to be here with all of you today, but apologies because I'm going to give my talk in English. But to help you, I'm going to speak very slowly. And in addition, I've used Spanish on my slides. And I very much hope that you will be able to understand the things that I want to share with you. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for the opportunity to learn about restoration in Ecuador these last couple of days. I'm very impressed with what I've heard, and I am so pleased and excited that a new red for Ecuador was formed yesterday. So congratulations, and thank you. We live truly in an amazing time, not just because we can Skype with people from China, Chile, the United States. We're one global community, but also because we live in what everybody now calls the Anthropocene, the time when the human footprint is so great. And it's easy to feel disheartened by degradation of our environment, but at the same time, we live in a time where people, all of us, so many people around the globe, there's a consensus about the importance of restoring our environment and reconnecting nature and culture. And it's so important at this time that we make good use of our society's interest in improving our environment. Because right now, around the world, we're spending over $3 trillion every year on ecological restoration. It is a grand experiment of our time. And my hope is that in 100 years, people say, we're so glad we invested $3 trillion every year just after the turn of the last century, because we got a lot of ecological value and social value out of those activities. But at the same time, my fear is like this cartoon, that it may be, in some cases, an experiment gone wrong. And it's up to us. We're the caretakers of how restoration is going to unfold over the next decades. And so I have a few things I want to share today, really three things that are bothering me about how restoration is unfolding and that I hope will change. But first, just a little something about my perspectives. I live in the temperate zone in an area with coniferous forests in Montana in the United States, which is very close to the border with Canada. I work at a university that's about the same size as the university here, 10,000 students. And I'm pleased to say that we have a very strong program in ecological restoration, which I would love to share with any of you who are interested. But today, really, I'm here on behalf of the Society for Ecological Restoration, who has played an important role in advancing both the science and the practice of ecological restoration. And the perspective of the society, our mission, is to enhance biological diversity and conservation, as well as human well-being, connecting the environment and people, nature and culture. The society was founded 25 years ago in Madison, Wisconsin, where I actually did my master's degree. And this picture is of the Arboretum, the garden, at Madison, Wisconsin, Curtis Prairie. And I'm showing this picture because it's emblematic. It illustrates what restoration was like at that time. Restoration occurred in very small parcels, like 1 hectare parcels, and the risk was very low. Now, of course, restoration is a global phenomenon. The United Nations conventions on combating desertification and biodiversity have all endorsed restoration as an important goal. And the society has been an important player in those activities. And we heard several times this week about the Bond Challenge, the challenge to restore 150 million hectares of forest land as a global community. And we see that there are pledges to get 57% of the way towards that ambitious goal. There's 13 pledges. Some of them are in groups, including the initiative 20 by 20. And I know that Ecuador's pledge is nested within that group. And of course, we also heard several times over the last few days about the Ike targets, Meta 15, 15% of degraded lands restored by 2020. And I've had an opportunity with the society to visit many places around the world. And I picked just one to share with you about the promise of restoration, and it's from Kuwait. This is an area that has one individual tree, one tree in the whole country of the only native tree species left. So in case you think you're not understanding my English, I'm telling you there's one tree left in Kuwait that's a native tree. And in addition, the country has been almost entirely denuded. If you go to an area that formerly had 400 species of flowering forbs in the desert, you will see no vegetation because of oil production, war, camping, overuse, other things I don't have time to talk about. But I want to show you this. This is a common garden of progeny from the one tree, which is called the lonely tree, that one tree, and seeds from this tree are now going to be out planted around Kuwait, and they have started a grand restoration to meet the 15% challenge for that country. And to me, seeing what's happening in Kuwait, if going from complete denuding of vegetation to restoration of the flora can happen in Kuwait, I feel it can really happen all over our planet. So that leads me to what I want to talk about today, and I have it from Jose Ignacio that I'm using the right word. In English, we say pitfall or pothole, and this is a sign showing what you should watch out for on the path, right? On our grand path towards restoration. I want to share 3 potential pitfalls. The first one is proceeding in the absence of any kind of strategy of priority areas to restore. right? How can we move forward without having a strategic plan of priority areas? Second, ecological restoration. Ecology is in the title. We, of course, know the importance of having strong benefits for humans and ecosystem goods and services. But I fear that in some ways we have lost the piece about ecosystem and biodiversity conservation in some ways that restoration is unfolding. And the third is lack of monitoring in a way that we can make inference. So it's not that we're not monitoring, it's that we're not doing monitoring in a way that is actually answering questions that we need to know the answers. So starting with my first one, this is something very personal to me, lack of a plan, a prioritization plan that's being implemented, because I work in forests of the Western United States. If any of you have looked at the Bond Challenge, if you're watching the red bar go from 57 to wherever it will go, you may have noticed the United States has pledged 15 million hectares. That's 10%. That's something to be celebrated, right? Or is it? What are we achieving? Are we achieving true restoration with that pledge? So now I have to say just a little bit about the forests that I love, and I'll do this quickly because it's just an example. The problem in our forests is how they've been managed. In some forests, we had relatively open canopy structures that have been filled in, and it's due to logging, grazing, and stopping fires. Ironically, stopping fires because Alta un photo. It's ironic because the problem is now wildfire burning too hot in our forests. And this is just a schematic to show the linkage between when fires occurred and establishment of trees. And you can see establishment of trees is low until after we started putting out fires. Okay. And here's the image I was looking for of the big management concern. People in their houses are being impacted by wildfire. See, so healthy forests provide an ecosystem service, wildfire protection. Now let's talk about what we're doing in the United States. In a period of 5 years, we treated 10 million hectares. And those treatments are here. These dots are the treatments. I did an analysis. I had the good fortune to analyze the 44,000 restoration treatments that were implemented in the Western United States, 11 states. And in addition, I developed a map, a prioritization map. The areas on this map that are in need of are predicted to be in need of restoration are in orange. I won't go into what's in the map. It's really not important, although it is important, but I don't have time to share today. But what I want to share today is when I overlapped predicted restoration need with where the treatments are occurring, I became very dismayed because there's a disconnect. We spent $10 billion on those treatments, 57% of which occurred in areas that had low or uncertain restoration need. Now, we did 43% predicted to have high need, but we're talking about $10 billion and an opportunity to improve our ecosystems, and I'd like to do better. So, I've listed the result. We accomplished something. We protected people. We are now providing an ecosystem service that's very important. However, there's impacts of those treatments, including impacts to soils, soil, wood, invasive plants. So did we gain in terms of biodiversity conservation, and can we call this restoration? And it's these treatments that are contributing to the 10% of the bond challenge. So I've listed some things I think we need to do. I'd like to see national, regional, continental work on prioritization. However, that work in and of itself is not enough, because we must then get those priorities up the chain to the UN conventions, to the IUCN, to all the people who are working to coordinate and fund. And so we need to coordinate our scientists and others who are doing these prioritization exercises. And then I think we need to synthesize across nations and regions. And that's really a number one priority for me and the Society for Ecological Restoration. Here's just the list you may have seen the map from the Bond Challenge. And just in case you're thinking, oh, well, there is a prioritization, here's what it shows for my region, my nation, and it says the data aren't useful. Okay. On to the second pitfall. This issue about ecological and social objectives. And I have to admit, I feel self-conscious saying that there's too much focus on social objectives, because that's not what I mean. Restoration will clearly not work without strong social objectives and human dimensions. That is clear. What I'm saying is that we also need to ensure that we have strong benefits for biodiversity conservation. So, carbon is an important ecosystem good and service. Timber, another. Fiber, another important ecosystem good and service. And in fact, again, my example of the Bond Challenge, it was those goods and services that led to this map of the world of opportunity. That's the approach that we've been running with. But when you tip the scale all the way down towards ecosystem services, biodiversity conservation may lose. And going back to my first example, in my forests, when you remove fuel, trees are called fuel. If you're worried about fire, you remove what we have as our legacy, our biological legacy that becomes soil wood, that enhances your understory community, that is in fact the very health of our forests. So what I'm hoping is something more like this, where we take a very broad look at restoration in terms of ecosystem goods and services and biodiversity conservation. And the Society for Ecological Restoration is spending quite a lot of time now working with the CBD as a partner in order to ensure that we don't forget biodiversity and ecosystems as we move forward with an agenda for restoration for human well-being. And since I'm on the topic of objectives of restoration, I could have put this as its own pitfall, but I've tagged it on to sneak it in. So just a few words about the fact that as we think about ecological objectives, we must remember that ecosystems, an inherent property of ecosystems, is change. It's ecology, it's our world, there's change. And I've put in this glacier. My own area was under ice for, not that long ago, 10,000 years ago. There was, 3-4 kilometers of ice where I live. And we know from looking at the pollen record that vegetation shifts and changes in response to climate. You can get a core from the bottom of the lake, and you can look at pollen spores at different levels, and it will tell you about that vegetation change. And of course, now, change, we are in an era of extremely rapid change. This is a map of the United States showing in just 15 years the changes in what we call hardiness zones. So those are the zones for determining where you can plant seeds of particular ecotypes. And on average, in 15 years, everywhere in the US has changed one zone. And of course, in the tropics, we're expecting to see very, very large changes as well. But the rapid environmental change is not just abiotic. It's also rapid biotic change, because plants are growing in environments with completely different biotic interactions than they're adapted to. And so we must keep this in mind for restoration from the big scale. What are the goals and objectives? We can't try to keep the world constant in any period of time with dynamic ecosystems, all the way to the project level. What seed will we use, right? Are we going to use seed that's adapted to past conditions, or maybe something else? And here's data from my lab looking at whether it makes sense to use seed for restoration that's adapted to growing with weeds. So we have seed that we call weed experienced from mother plants growing with weeds, and seeds that have not been exposed to these invasive plants. And you can see an interaction effect when they're grown without weeds and with weeds. That's the interaction effect, that the weed experienced plants do better. They're better competitors when they're growing with weeds. Just a small example. Action items. We need to balance the objectives and ensure that we don't lose sight of biodiversity conservation. In restoration planning, we must plan for dynamic ecosystems, because that's part of our planet, this constant environmental change, and because we have a special rate of change right now. And third, monitoring. And we heard Mauricio talk about monitoring, several other people talk about monitoring, so we all know monitoring is important. I have a small additional piece that I'd like to share about how we need to go about monitoring. And why I chose to share this is because I keep seeing assessments of achieving restoration targets. And those assessments are largely based on whether the work got done. So we say implementation. We're assessing if a project was implemented. And this is a plan for restoration. If the contractor does all this, we count those hectares. We see we're 57% to the goal, but that doesn't tell us, we haven't monitored what we've achieved. There's a very nice summary of monitoring of river restoration that was published in Ecology, of 30,000 river restoration projects in the United States. Someone, Emily Bernhardt, she's at Duke, wanted to know, what is the outcome of all this restoration? And after assessing 30,000 projects, she concluded that it was not possible to assess the success of restoration, because fewer than 10% of projects included assessment. Now, I do not believe that every single project needs to be assessed. And I said to someone yesterday, we believe in things in life without testing everything. Otherwise you couldn't live. I flip my light switch on, I don't have to do an experiment if my light bulb works or not, because it's been tested for me. So I think with monitoring, we need to have a strategic plan of questions. We can't just be collecting everything everywhere in a passive way. So just a few points on that. We do monitoring in the US of some projects, and often it leads to this. Maybe not anymore. It leads to bytes and megabytes. Okay? The problem is that here's implementation monitoring, surveillance monitoring. This is like checking the weather. But if you're doing question-driven monitoring, that's what we mean. We want to know the effects, the efficacy of our activities. That is truly an endeavor that requires a scientific approach. So this next schematic, I'll just take a minute to go through it. It shows the best approach for making inference from management activities. And it goes from no monitoring, the activity is a burn, fire as a restoration tool, to you just check after. Well, you don't know what was there before, so you can't make inference. And sometimes people will check before and after on a site. Can you make inference? No, because annual variation is huge in ecosystems. And so if you compare before and after, you don't know if it had anything to do with what you did. So to make inference truly, you need to look before and after on treated and untreated sites. And that's a lot to do. But I would prefer to organize monitoring this way at a subset of places where we work to answer key questions than to monitor everything that we can without a plan for analysis or clear questions. And so, for an effective monitoring program, it's not just the data collection, it's a monitoring plan. It includes a plan for data analysis and interpretation, for managing the data, because monitoring, of course, must occur over time. So without data management, you can't return to the site. For technology transfer, for assessing your monitoring program. And all of this must be figured out before you start the project. Because otherwise, you can't do an assessment before and after control treatment, which is the strongest way to make inference. And so I very much like this schematic. It's very ugly, but I like it anyway, because it shows at the same time together project implementation, monitoring implementation, development of each plan at the same time. In addition, it's easy to show a pattern in a single place and hard to make inference from that. However, if we do effective monitoring, we then have information for meta-analysis to combine information and have real power to move forward and improve based on evidence our restoration planning. And this is something that the Society for Ecological Restoration is also very interested in through our Global Restoration Network. And I hope we'll have something amazing to share with you in the near future where we can receive your information and provide forums to synthesize data. We already have our journal, Restoration Ecology. But to publish in Restoration Ecology is a big task for a manager, because as many of you know, to write an article, you need to have a lot of theory and background. And so I think maybe what is needed is a short format where we can quickly share results. But I did want to point out to any of you who have done projects that have been a complete failure, and you feel like your money is entirely wasted because you did not accomplish your goal, you learned something from what you did that's important to share. And the journal Restoration Ecology has a section just for you to share your failures called Setbacks and Surprises. Because, of course, if we don't share what didn't work, then people will continue to do the activities that led to failure. There's also opportunities, of course, to network in SIACRE, in your national REDs, but also with the society at a global level. And I didn't want to leave here without the opportunity to tell you the importance of doing that, because while the Society for Ecological Restoration, an international group, is not an expert in your local restoration treatments and even your regional ones, we can bring lessons learned and synthesize information and bring that to the global forum. So the Society, as I mentioned, played a really important role in the Aichi targets and in the UN conventions, and we aim to continue to do so. But in order to do that in the right manner, we need to represent restoration around the globe. And to do that, we need all of you, or at least some of you from lots of regions, to be participating. And so you're all invited. I hope to see many of you at our conference in Brazil, again, which is hosted not just by SCR International, but also by SIACRE and SOBRE, the local host. So my action items in this area are, when we talk about monitoring, we need to be specific. We're not talking about implementation monitoring. Yes, we do want to document how many hectares are treated. We want to know if we hit 150 million. However, more important to me is I want to know that 100 years from now, my children's children's children will think it was a good investment. We need to ensure that where we're investing and monitoring, we're making smart decisions and we're using methods that will allow us to make inference. Because monitoring can be very expensive, and we can't afford to waste that money as well. And then finally, of course, we want to share results to make sure that outside of our local corners, other people are benefiting from what we've learned along the way. So in closing, I am unbelievably excited to be part of this time where we're not pitting preservation, against use of the environment, but rather working together, people doing good for ecosystems and for human well-being. And this work is so important. I'm so pleased to see so many people here, and I'm so impressed with the group who is here and the work that you're doing, and honored to have been invited to meet you and participate. And so I look forward to an optimistic future where we all work together to get the big wins that we want from our global restoration community. So thank you. And if you have questions, you can ask them in Spanish, and I will likely understand you. And if I don't, I will ask my friends here to help. Yes.
Hola, Cara, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Hablaste del caso de Estados Unidos y esta falta de equilibrio entre objetivos sociales y objetivos ecológicos. ¿Por qué crees que eso ha sucedido en Estados Unidos?
I think it's a problem not just in the United States, but everywhere. There's the inception of an idea, protecting our environment, and in doing so, we'll protect human well-being. But that's laid over a culture of using resources for human well-being. And so when the idea gets big enough and there's a groundswell, then it's easy to say, oh, well, what we want to do fits what we as managers in the United States, forest managers, want to do, is actually fitting with this concept of restoration. And so instead of timber management, we're managing for an ecosystem good and service. And after all, that's restoration. See? And so it's a little bit of a slippery slope because I think at the global initiative level, people have good in their hearts and want to do the right thing. But we're humans and we want to help humans too. Yet biodiversity doesn't necessarily have a representative at the table. Now, that's not true. There's the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there's many, many groups that focus on biodiversity conservation. But there's also a big imperative to take care of humans on our planet. And I do not mean, just so no one leaves here confused about my perspective, thumbs up on that imperative. We must do that. We must provide for human well-being. I just want to ensure that we take a broad perspective, because in 100 years, if we have taken all the fuel, or you could call it soil wood, or you could call it forest health from our forests in the United States, we won't be protecting the well-being of humans 100 years from now. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure I understand the question, so. Yeah. Well, that's really hard for me to answer, and I'm thinking of why, and I think it's because in the United States, all natural resource management right now is solidly within the sphere of restoration. Almost everything is restoration. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so there's the field of restoration ecology, the science behind the practice, right? And so my own mission of my lab and my career is to infuse the practice of restoration with that appropriate ecological science. I don't think I answered your question, but I don't know if I have an answer. Maybe we can talk after too. Yeah.
Pienso que crees que el objetivo de Bonn se va a cumplir. ¿Cómo debemos reaccionar si no se cumple?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do. I think the Bonn Challenge is excellent. And I think that all of the initiatives are an amazing opportunity. Right now, we have an amazing opportunity. My hope is that we all participate in the experience of the opportunity to get the result that is the best for our planet, for biodiversity, for human well-being. And so I think right now we're trying to figure out, right? There's the SUBSTA meetings coming up. There's many conventions going on right now, action plans. The CBD has an action plan. And this is why I chose to make these remarks today, because time to, as James Aronson wrote in Restoration Ecology, time to roll up the sleeves. We need to roll up our sleeves and get in there and not say, oh, we have the targets. We created a lofty goal. Yeah, we created a goal and let's get there and get there in the right way. And I think these action items I have, to me, would improve the quality of what we get out of the experience. Okay.
Gracias. Buenos días. Primeramente quiero agradecer su presencia aquí en nuestra ciudad. Espero que haya estado a su altura y la hayamos recibido con mucha hospitalidad, como nos caracteriza a los lojanos. Quiero comentarle que tengo una muy bonita experiencia de su país, especialmente del estado de Minnesota, la ciudad de los lagos.
Bueno.
Y me llamó mucho la experiencia porque yo pensaba que no había vegetación, porque acá se tiene como que es una ciudad, un país capitalista, que explota, que no tiene, y para mí fue una gran sorpresa de ver que hay hermosos parques nacionales donde desde los niños tienen un cuidado mucho con desde los insectos, las aves, y tienen esa cultura de poner agua, semillas, y también una experiencia muy bonita con esa hermosa universidad que es de Minnesota. Yo le pregunto a usted, ¿esto se debe a que la educación como fenómeno social propone la formación de la conciencia social, y por eso la educación la cultura ambiental debe partir desde la educación? Esa es mi pregunta.
So if I understood you, you're asking me about the importance of education and human dimensions of restoration. And I think the human dimensions of restoration needs to be elevated, especially in project planning, because we need to have strong human dimension goals in order to have those outcomes. And also within the society for ecological restoration, we need within our society more emphasis on the human dimensions. And so again, I'm glad you asked that question, because it gives me an opportunity again to say that restoration is vital for ecosystem goods and services, for building what you mentioned, a link between people, culture, and nature. So many important human dimensions of restoration, and they're all close to my heart too. So the only thing I wanted to say is that I noticed this lacking, we're slipping away from the ecological goals. Yes, but the human piece is something that I view as equally important as the ecological piece, for sure. Yeah, thank you. And it is so beautiful here. When I flew here and I looked out the airplane, I was glued to the window of the airplane because the forests are so beautiful. It's been a real pleasure to get to know a little of the environment. Thank you.
Agradecemos una vez más la participación de Cara Nelson, quien nos ha apoyado en la conferencia de Mejora la calidad de la restauración ecológica a escala global. En este momento vamos a dividir la sala para poder empezar con las ponencias. En este lugar